and a very warm welcome to the Sound of Economics, Bruegel's podcast. My name is Guntram Wolff and I'm the director of Bruegel, and today I'm joined by two Bruegel senior fellows, Simone Tagliapietra and André Sapir. Hello and welcome.
Hello, Guntram.
Hello, Guntram. Hello, Simone.
So today we are here to discuss a very important topic, namely how the European Union would like to deliver on its very ambitious climate goals, what the EU has dubbed the European Green Deal. And by the way, it has also dubbed it Europe's growth strategy. Europe's Green Deal is also Europe's growth strategy in the words of the Commission President. The package was released on July the 14th and is a very comprehensive package covering a lot of different areas, from taxation on regulation to the emission trading system, as well as social implications of the Green Deal and the external dimensions of the Green Deal, including the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So it's a very comprehensive and big package, lots of pages, 13 individual initiatives. It really was initially called Fit for 55. Now, that's not a slogan for a fitness class. On the contrary, the idea is it's about reducing CO2 emissions and greenhouse gas emissions by 55% until 2030 relative to the level at which they were in 1990. So a pretty ambitious package, more ambitious than what used to be the goal. The goal used to be 40% reduction by 2030. Now it is 55%, meaning, of course, that the measures needed to become tighter and more encompassing. Now, we want to start that conversation with Simone giving us a first overview, a first sketch of the main elements of what was proposed yesterday. Then we want to zoom in on, how much this will deliver, what will be the implications. And of course, we also want to discuss distributional issues and, of course, very importantly, also the very controversial, but in my view, important carbon border adjustment mechanism proposals. So that's the plan for the next 25, 30 minutes. Please bear with us if we get too technical. We try to explain and unpack really this very important package. Simone, let me start with you. Why don't you give us a quick overview of what are the main elements of this package?
Thank you, Guntram. This is indeed a jumbo package because it includes around 13 different proposals, which are really aimed at deepening and broadening the European decarbonisation process. With this package, as you said, the Commission wants to turn its European Green Deal ambitions into real-world action. And to do that, it needs to upgrade the EU climate, transport, energy, but also economic policy at large. So this package includes, first of all, an upgrade of existing tools. To give you an example, there is a tightening of the ETS, which currently covers electricity, industry, and domestic aviation.
So the emission trading system.
It will be enlarged to the maritime sector, and this will deliver the carbon pricing that is required to change investment patterns, for example, in the industrial and electricity sector. Then the Commission wants to increase the renewable energy target we currently have of a level of 32% by 2030 in terms of final energy consumption to a level of 40%. Then there is an increase in the energy efficiency target from 32% by 2030 to 36% by 2030. And this is really an upgrade, let's say, of the classical EU climate policy measures. Then the package takes really a step further and includes brand new instruments to decarbonize the transport and the building sectors. Why this focus on transport and building? Well, because the EU so far has failed to convincingly decarbonize these sectors, which correspond for 22% of total emissions, transportation, and 35% of total emissions, buildings. So there is no way to get to our climate targets if we don't successfully decarbonize these two sectors. And that's exactly the reason why the European Commission proposes to establish a new ETS, a new carbon market for these two sectors in order to start having a carbon price also in these fields. And another very important element of the package certainly is the tightening of the CO2 standards for cars, which will basically pay a farewell to diesel and gasoline cars in 2035 if successfully achieved. As you mentioned, another very important element relates to taxation. Europe currently has an energy taxation directive, which is very old, which factually incentivizes fossil fuels instead of clean fuels. And there is here a proposal to radically reshape the way we tax energy in Europe, taking into consideration the environmental performance of fuels. And by the way, there is also an enlargement of taxation to new sectors that currently do not pay taxes, such as, for example, jet fuel, or again, the fuel required for the shipping industry. So here we are really reshaping a lot of different sectors, and given this major transformation of the economy, the Commission wants to protect the European industry, or better, to ensure level playing field between the European industry and the outside industry with the introduction of carbon border adjustment measures that I'm sure we are going to debate in detail afterwards.
Well, thanks a lot, Simone. That was a tour de force of a very complex package, and thanks for explaining it so well. I guess the first question that I would really want to throw at you is whether you can give us a sense of whether this package is going to achieve what it wants to achieve. Will it achieve the 55% reduction in greenhouse gases, or will we fall short with it? What is your overall assessment?
Look, my overall assessment of this package is positive. And I think if we are to implement completely the package as it is, we might really get to our climate target in 2030. For a different number of reasons. First, we are really fostering renewable energy here. We are really fostering energy efficiency, and we are really tightening the emission trading scheme in electricity and industry. So if we manage to really achieve these, sectorial targets, then emissions in major sectors such as electricity and industry will really go down. Then there is the issue of transport and buildings. Here, honestly, I think lies the most transformative measures entailed in the package. If we really get to a phase out of diesel and gasoline cars in 2035, so no new sales of these internal combustion engine cars, by then, in 2050, the European car park will be completely decarbonized. If you look at buildings, we are inserting a carbon price in the building sector, and the idea is to use the revenues of this carbon market to help citizens basically doing buildings renovation and energy efficiency measures at home, with a particular focus on the low-income households. And I think this is exactly what we need. Of course, this is a very difficult sector. Families do not respond to price signals as an industry because there are upfront costs entailed and so on. So here we need a mix of policies. And very importantly, in the fall, the Commission will present the last elements of this package, which also includes the Building Renovation Directive. And that will also be a very important component of the decarbonization of the building sector we need to achieve. But all in all, I think that with these measures, we can get there. Of course, the question is how much this package will be watered down in the negotiations among the co-legislators.
Well, before we move, thanks, Simone. Before we move to the politics, I do want to ask you still a very sort of naive question that I think many economists have raised when they saw this package. I mean, the normal reaction of an economist is to the climate issue and the climate change externality, global public good problem, is to say, well, we need to basically impose a tax, or we need to restrict the quantity of emissions that is allowed, and have one single system, one single price system to guide the most efficient and the least costly decarbonization. Now, why does the Commission think differently, and why do we have not one emission trading system, but now two emission trading systems, then some sectors excluded, then some issues are done with regulation? Why this patchwork of measures instead of really having one encompassing emission trading system that would allow, the prices to trade off between, the speed of decarbonization in different sectors? I mean, let's just take the transport sector. I mean, why would it not have made sense to include the transport sector directly in the emission trading system? Of course, some argue that would have forced industry to decarbonize more quickly, but that's exactly what we want. We want the sectors to decarbonize more quickly, where the cost of decarbonization is less. And in the transport sector, arguably, it's going to be very, very difficult, especially if you want to do long distance travel. So why this package? Why this segmentation of measures? What's the logic behind it? And do you think it's a mistake, or do you think it's appropriate?
Well, provocatively, Guntram, I can say that often in economics textbooks, you find solutions for a best world, while we live in a second best world in which you need to find compromises to fit economic solutions which would be ideal to the political circumstances that you have around you. And this is exactly the case of carbon tax. I mean, all economists, I think, agree that carbon tax is the best way to foster decarbonization. And we have been saying that for at least, I think, 50 years, if not even more. But the problem is that you need to make these measures socially acceptable and politically viable. And what the Commission is doing here is to adopt a second emission trading system for transport and building in order to maintain the efficiency of the current ETS we have in electricity and industry, in which, as you know, the price of polluting has incredibly raised over the last few months to a level of 50, 60 euros per ton of CO2. So the system is delivering in these sectors. And the idea is that you cannot put immediately a price tag of 60 euro per ton to the transportation and the building sector, because otherwise you get the gilets jaunes on the streets of each individual European capital as of tomorrow. You need to acknowledge that these sectors, which touch the daily life of European citizens and also small, medium enterprises, by the way, need to be accompanied in a more progressive manner. And notably, you need to provide people the viable alternatives. You cannot push people out of their diesel car if they cannot afford to buy an electric car. And this is exactly what the Commission wants to do here. It's first, we incentivize new technologies and we put the money out there to do so. And I think here the Social Climate Fund is very important. We can discuss that afterwards. And then we start to factor in the carbon price. So I think it's a good compromise between what would be ideally, really ideal in the economics textbook and what is the political reality out there. Look, already this proposal will be highly contentious. So I think this is a good balance.
Well, I mean, let me on this point also bring in André, because I have to say, I mean, I understand, of course, that there are political constraints and that these are difficult negotiations. At the same time, it sounds somewhat like a policy of having your cake and want to eat it at the same time. I mean, on the one hand, we want to get rid of combustion engines through regulation. On the other hand, we are not ready to price CO2 emissions appropriately from cars, where, by the way, of course, the taxation of emissions is already extremely high. I mean, the gasoline tax is very high, and it's not a tax for emissions, but it is de facto a tax that is closely linked to emissions. So this notion that it's going to be easier to get rid of cars through regulation than and socially more acceptable to get rid of combustion engine cars through regulation rather than through higher including them in the ETS. I find that logic difficult to understand. But André, what's your overall take on sort of the economic efficiency / political trade-offs that we are facing in this package?
So I'm unable really to comment on the question that you asked to Simone, which is whether or not the plan is sufficiently ambitious to reach the minus 55 by 2030. So I take the answer of Simone and have nothing to add there. So I think then the question for me is one of distribution, indeed. So the politics, which I think, as Simone rightly say, we don't live in the first best world. We probably don't even live in the second or third best world. We live, in a world full of imperfections, and one has to deal with that reality. So yes, I can understand indeed the fact that one has a second ETS market for the road transport and for building, because it touches on a different group and more directly on a different group of people than some of the measures on let's say industry that are very, very indirect for citizens, right? I mean, we all use cement, but we use cement in a very indirect manner compared to heating our house or putting gas in the tank, right? So we don't march, we don't put our gilets jaunes about cement. So no, I mean, what is the politics here? I think there is politics of within countries and across countries, which I think is relevant. From an EU perspective, maybe the latter is more directly relevant, because we know that this will not affect all EU countries in the same manner, nor that the enthusiasm for the carbon emission reduction is the same. When you look at Eurobarometer, you see that there is a split within our countries by income group and by location. The urban, more affluent are much more on board with the measures than people of low income, especially if they live in the countryside. And then across countries, you have the same thing. Let's say in the EU 15 countries, in the richer EU countries, there's much more willingness or even enthusiasm for the Green Deal than you find in the lower income countries, especially in Central and Eastern Europe. Now, on the second one, the EU can do something about this, right? I mean, the EU is also partly a transfer EU. The euro area is not a transfer euro area, but the EU is a transfer EU. So we do transfer, large amount of money from richer countries, richer regions to poorer regions and countries. And so there, I think that problem can be partly handled via the EU budget and the transfers. This is about countries or regions. But then remains the issue within the richer countries. What happens in France? What happens in Italy across different regions? Again, the urban versus the rural. And we have seen that split already present in many of the issues. This is about globalization, this is about migrants, and this is also about climate. So that fracture, in a sense, in our society is there. And I think in the end, there's not much that the EU can do about it. This is about domestic, local politics, and the EU is to be an observer of that and see that. So I think this is really a very, very important issue for me, the politics. So less perhaps the politics across countries than the politics within countries. And that means that indeed countries will have to put in place all kinds of measures, and this will be measures that are tailored at the national, regional level. What Italy will do is not what Sweden will do or what Greece will do. Different countries will have to react to this and to take into account their political and socio-economic realities.
Well, André, of course, the distributional implications of climate measures are very, very important topic on which we have done significant work. And let me recall here that our colleague Georg ZACHMANN, who is not today in this call, has produced a blueprint issue, I think, last year. I think one of the interesting findings is that, of course, the distribution implications are not quite as straightforward as one thinks when looking at the issue of taxation, because there's also implications for asset prices and implications for capital owners. So the distribution implications are not quite as clear, I would say. But of course, I think politically, as you, I think, described, the rural and less affluent citizens will feel it most directly, the changes. And I would again insist whether it's going to be the price of the diesel that will increase, or whether it's going to be the price of the car because you have to buy an electric car that increases. I don't think that will make much of a difference. In any case, they will see their transport has become more expensive, much more expensive. And so my understanding is that the EU in its current package that it's proposing has foreseen to use some of the revenues from this additional emission trading system to, let's say, compensate and do transfers to those that lose on the social front. Simone, perhaps you can say a few words about what the Commission is proposing there. To what extent is it a measure that targets distribution between countries? And to what extent is it a measure that can also help overcome the rural-urban divide that we are seeing in many of our societies?
Yeah, first of all, I wanted to say that the way André put it, I think it's perfect. No, this let's say climate justice question really has two dimensions. On the one hand, there is the regional dimension that André described, and by the way, let me recall that to tackle that regional dimension, the EU set up the Just Transition Fund, which was not by coincidence the main initiative promoted under the European Green Deal. Now, there is the other dimension, which is within countries, urban-rural divide, which is exactly what we have seen in France as well. And to tackle that second element, which in my view is way more important than the previous one, if you look at the scale, the Commission is doing two things in this package. First of all the revenues that member states will get from the new ETS for buildings and transport will have to be entirely utilized by member states to basically incentivize building renovation and clean mobility, electric vehicles uptake, with a specific focus on low-income households. On top of this, member states can, for a limited period of time, make use of the revenues to give direct compensation to the most vulnerable families affected by this policy, which is in practice what in theory is the concept of carbon dividends that, as we know, have now attracted a lot of intellectual support, also by this manifesto that 3,500 US economists published a year and a half ago, among which also Janet Yellen. So I think the direction is right. Then on top of this measure of obliging member states to use these revenues for this purpose, the EU is doing what? Is sparing 25% of the revenues of the system to build up an EU-wide social climate fund, which the member states will be able to assess, again, to do investments for low-income families, for buildings, renovation, and electric cars, basically uptake, co-funding national actions. This fund is really going to function as the Recovery and Resilience Facility or as the current Just Transition Fund. So countries will have to design a social climate plan. They will have to submit this plan to the Commission and then ask the funding to implement these measures. And then there will be the monitoring. So if the countries don't deliver, the disbursement will not be made. And as an Italian, I like this way of going very much because you oblige the government to stick to what it has promised, and you have a duly monitoring of how these EU resources at the end are utilized. So I think this is a very effective manner to also push countries to do the right things they have to do to ensure basically social justice while we do this deep decarbonization process.
Simone, can I intervene and ask you a provocative question?
Mm-hmm.
You know me, I'm not a provocative person. But if I were a provocative person, I would ask you very simply, are we moving to green socialism?
Well, I don't think so. Of course, this is a very provocative take. If you were to be provocative, of course. And I think what we are moving to is a system in which, look at what is happening these days in Germany and Belgium. I mean, before the flood arrives, we need to take action. And we know very well that the cost of non-action here is going to be way higher than the cost of action, right? So here it's all about how do we manage the transition. And here, I think we now have a clear idea about what are the different policies we need. And here we have a first attempt at the global level to do so. Because let me remind that while almost all countries in the world so far have adopted climate neutrality target and so on, Europe is the first to try to turn this ambition into a real policy. So this is imperfect. But it is imperfect because we are front runners, so we are alone, really. I mean, if you look at even at the United States, the conversation is way behind the level in which it is in Europe. So I think we are facing a great challenge, but if we don't get this right, the cost of non-action will be substantially higher, and that will require massive increased investments in adaptation that, by the way, we will need to make anyhow, as we are seeing these days. So here, I think this is a revolution. So I don't know if it is a socialist revolution, Andrea, but it is certainly a revolution that we need because nature is imposing this revolution on us, because we have simply went beyond the natural boundaries, and we need, with the technology we have at our disposal and with the innovative technology that we have to develop, to decouple our economic growth from natural resources utilization. And with Guntram and another colleague, class at Bruegel, we are working on this issue with a paper that is exactly devoted to this topic.
Right. But Simone, that's right, and I think few, I would say, academically trained individuals doubt the need for action, given the evidence, the clear evidence on climate change. So I don't think that the action itself is controversial. I mean, it will be painful to implement, but it's on a theoretical level, I don't think it's controversial. What I do think is more controversial is the social dimension, I have to say, because what you just described, and I think Andre's question of socialism was a little bit going in that direction, is actually quite a heavy interference of the EU into national distributional questions. And I was personally surprised by the way you described it. I mean, we have very elaborate welfare states that take care of the bulk of redistribution, huge amounts of redistribution, in fact. This additional package is, of course, small quantitatively compared to our welfare states, very small. And so I wonder how much of a difference it will make and how it will interact with the national welfare systems. But I'm afraid we don't have that much time to discuss that issue. If you want to react to that point, of course, but I do think we also want to spend a few minutes on the global dimension. And I think
it's another distributional dimension, by the way.
Which is another distributional dimension, absolutely. And I think on the global dimension, I think the starting point really has to be that the EU cannot save the climate on its own, right? So the EU only contributes 7% of global emissions at the moment. It's not enough if the EU decarbonizes and the rest of the world doesn't. Now, one important element of the whole package is the so-called carbon border adjustment mechanism, which really was intended, I think, to have really has two intentions. One intention is, of course, to ensure the level playing field or prevent that domestic producers are disadvantaged because of the domestic tax on emissions relative to foreign producers that are not faced with the tax. So that's a sort of a more industrial argument. But there's also a climate argument, which is essentially saying, well, we want this carbon border adjustment mechanism to provide an incentive to foreign producers that want to sell in our market to actually decarbonize as well. So that's the theoretical concept. And interestingly, also yesterday on the 14th of July, there was a similar announcement by the United States Democratic Party, US Democrats, that were also saying, well, we need some sort of a external tax on emissions incorporated in imports. Andre, where do you see this whole discussion at the moment? Where do you see the pitfalls and where do you think will it go?
Well, I think, Guntram, you described very well what is the purpose of the CBAM, both the level playing field that is dealing with the fact that our domestic producers, at least in 5 sectors in Europe, 5 industrial sectors, but also electricity, sectors where there is international competition, sectors where so far domestic, although those sectors are subject to the ETS, domestic producers have received free allowances. So in a sense, the price of carbon that they faced was zero, essentially. Now, this is going to be phased out gradually over a 10-year period from 2025 to 2035. Every year for 10% of this free allowance will be reduced. And by 2035, there will be no free allowance. And at the same time, indeed, imports of those products into the EU will be subject to a adjustment measure, a sort of a tax that is foreign producers will also have, in a sense, to buy those permits. So they will be facing, if they want to export to the EU, they will be facing the same price of carbon that our domestic producers will. And that indeed will sort of create a level playing field between domestic producers and their competitors, but hopefully it will also incentivize a number of foreign countries to also introduce stricter measures for carbon reduction. So I think the intellectual story, the economic story actually behind the CBAM is pretty watertight. Makes a lot of sense. and it has a lot of advantages. Now, it's not because it's sort of there's efficiency gains in principle that there may not be problems. There may be legal problems. There may be political problems. The legal problem, which I think is not very high, in fact, is the question whether this system will be compatible with WTO commitments. And I think that, again, on paper, in theory, when you read the proposal by the Commission, it is compatible with the WTO rules. I think an open question, which we cannot answer based on what we have seen so far, is whether in practice it will be compatible. That is, there's still a lot of legislation to be announced as to the precise elements, the precise, in particular, administrative dimension of the operation of the CBAM. And there, there can be administrative costs, and there can be a number of hidden costs. There can be some maybe unintended but still barriers to foreign producers that may be sort of non-tariff barriers that may be problematic and may be challenged. So it's not the CBAM principle that would be challenged at the WTO, but maybe some of the elements of their implementation. But again, I think that relatively minor, in fact. I think the bigger problem is the political problem. We know that 10 years ago, roughly, when the EU did introduce a CBAM, of an equivalent of a CBAM for one sector, aviation, it had eventually to back down because there was huge backlash coming from just about every major countries, whether it was the US, it was China, it was India. They said no way, and the EU had to back down. So it was not whether it was legal or not legal; it was just politically not acceptable. Now we are 10 years later also, and when you look at the CBAM is the complement to our carbon pricing system. In our case, essentially the ETS. We do see that the ETS is being adopted by other countries. I mean, Canada is adopting an ETS, China is adopting an ETS, and other countries are adopting carbon taxes. So I think this notion of carbon pricing that was also mentioned in the G20 meeting in Venice a week ago is progressing. So I think that, the notion that, if you have carbon pricing domestically, you may need some carbon pricing externally. Again, intellectually, I think it's feasible, at least with some countries. Then there are countries that are refusing to put in place carbon pricing mechanism. And take the case of the United States, unlikely to put a carbon pricing mechanism, but it may be using other methods of reducing carbon emission. And there will be an issue. How do we apply our CBAM to countries that are taking measures that are consistent with Paris, but that are not of the carbon pricing type? How are we going to sort of decide whether or not those countries or exporters from those countries should be subject to the tax? What is the way of measuring this? What is the equivalence? And I think that can be an issue. And then there are countries that are reluctant altogether to act, either through carbon pricing or through quantitative measures or innovation. And there, I think you're talking of developing countries, essentially. Now, I think the proposal by the Commission, I think rightly so, in terms of WTO compatibility, does not make a difference between countries, whether they are poor countries or rich countries. The CBAM would apply across the board to all countries, depending on their carbon emission, not depending on their level of income. That is sure to create a backlash unless there are transfers. So are we going to use some of the money that we are going to collect from the CBAM? Are we going to use it to transfer it to poorer countries? The same kind of discussion that we had before about within the EU, between the richer countries and the poorer countries. Are we going to apply this logic also internationally? At the moment, it is not foreseen. But it seems to me that without doing that, it's going to be very, very difficult to not have a huge political backlash from developing countries, not just the poorest developing countries, but even from countries like India, that would lead the coalition of developing countries. So I think, again, the distributional issue will be the crucial issue in this respect.
Well, I mean, so still some work to do. Simone, I don't know if you wanted to give a last very quick comment on the CBAM or more generally, and then we would, I think, conclude, because this has already begun a very comprehensive and complex discussion. But Simone, just one word.
No, maybe one thing on the CBAM, one adjective which I would utilize also to describe this system is graduality. No, I mean, this system will enter into force in 2023. There will be a 3-year transitional period, so we are already in 2026, and the system only starts, as André said, working on really a few carbon intensive sectors. So there is a long way before these systems really becomes full-fledged and covers all European imports. And maybe as a closing remark from my side, I would like to say that this is a little bit the way we might also read this overall Fit for 55 package, because there are certain measures which are already well established: renewable energy directive, energy efficiency, current ETS, which are going to be upgraded and which will deliver most of the emissions reduction from here to 2030 we need to get to the target. What we are also doing here is really, in my view, to set up the institutional architecture of what will have to happen between 2030 and 2050 to get to climate neutrality. So here we are really setting a sort of testing period for new measures such as CBAM, such as the ETS for road transport and buildings, which will be crucial, in my view, not really up to 2030, but after, between 2030 and 2050, where the difficult emissions reductions will have to be achieved. So I think we need also to read this package over a longer time horizon than only 2030, because here we are really, laying the foundations of the climate neutrality architecture we will require be after 2030 to get to the climate neutrality target in 2050. Thank you.
Well, wonderful, Simone. Thank you so much. And thank you, André. We have discussed many, many issues. We have left out one sector, which is still important and which we don't have time to discuss, which is agriculture. Agriculture is not part of this package, even though globally agriculture contributes something like almost 20% to greenhouse gas emissions. So it's clearly a sector where action is needed and where EU action has so far been insufficient. But we don't have time to discuss that today. And so let me just conclude by thanking you, André, and thanking you, Simone, for this very comprehensive and I hope useful discussion. And I want to thank you, our listeners, for tuning in today on our podcast, The Sound of Economics. Please join us again. Join us also on our website, where you will find more written analysis on this and related topics. Thanks a lot, and bye-bye.